Good morning, everyone. Just in case you're worrying, I'm not going to give you an ethics lecture this morning. You're obviously all ridiculously talented and intelligent people, and I think you would have the professional ethics as it relates to design and your discipline under control. So I don't intend to talk specifically about that, but I'd like to talk about our responsibilities to each other as human beings as well as designers. And the question I want to talk about, or perhaps suggest answers to, is what are our obligations to each other as people and as designers in this room right now, right here in Sydney, February 26, 2016. But first, a commercial break. For those who don't speak or read German, it said in 30 years the Arctic will be ice-free, and as it turns out, polar bears can drown. It's a powerful climate change advertisement by Greenpeace Germany. So you may have seen something about this issue recently. It crossed my radar maybe 20 years ago, possibly even earlier, because I can't really remember. I was too busy making cool stuff, having fun, not really engaging with the issue. I knew it was happening. I knew climate change was a real thing. I think I believed the scientists before the politicians fairly early on in that awakening or awareness that I had, but it didn't change my behaviour. I still drove a gas-guzzling S-Series Valiant, had a fondness for vintage cars. I still travelled to far-flung places on emission-spewing planes. I even drank imported beer, but really back then there wasn't the the excellent craft beer revolution, so I can give my old self a break on that. But knowing about climate change didn't change me, but this did. And this book I read in 2000 after returning from working and travelling in the UK and Europe. I was sitting under a tree in Bondi and I was avoiding the Olympics, basically, thinking about what I wanted to do with my life. And this book, probably more than anything else, inspired me to start Digital Eskimo. And it really inspired me to apply my energies to make a world that was more equitable and abundant. So if you're not familiar with Chomsky's work, this particular book describes the year 1991, which is the 501st year of the European conquest of the world. He goes into great detail, as Chomsky does, describing the genocide of the colonial times. You'd be familiar with much of it. The murder and exploitation associated with what really is still the colonial conquest of the planet, the modern day imperialism. Obviously, the United States takes the brunt of Noam Chomsky's criticisms. So this book, after reading and absorbing it, presented for me an ethical or moral dilemma. Once I understood how much I personally benefited from that conquest, I felt like I needed to respond. And sadly, that conquest continues to this day. So after all, we're on Gadigal land, the land of the Eora Nation. It's on their land that we meet today. So I'll pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and also to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today. So we, and when I say we, I mean my fellow European descendants, perhaps more specifically, we stole this rather well-resourced land over 200 years ago, at gunpoint predominantly, and we're all doing relatively well today with our resources boom and all of the things that have happened since, at least in part. Not entirely, but at least in part, due to this undeniable fact. So we are inside that Chomsky narrative of colonialism. So I'm not suggesting we feel guilty. You and I didn't do it. We weren't there. But we do have a moral responsibility, I believe, to make good somehow. Because we benefit from it every day. So, unfortunately, as it turns out, that old adage that there's no such thing as a free lunch is true again. And we've inherited, as well as that great wealth, a massive burden. Because it turns out there's a bill waiting at the end of the meal. So, in Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, she connects climate change, this issue we sometimes see as a separate single issue, with this extractive mentality that was exported with that European mob. It's why she argues that we've struggled for probably 50 years, 30 more intensely, I guess, to take on the culprit, to deal with what's causing runaway climate change. We're kind of struggling to step outside of a system we're inside of, and we're products of it. So the neoliberal capitalist worldview, it's all pervasive. It's in every one of us. It's in the halls of power. It's in the dining and dining rooms and kitchens of Australia. Which is why, if we're going to stop climate change, we're going to have to, as she so eloquently puts it, change everything. We need to change this very system that we're standing on, working in and with. We need to redesign capitalism. Now that's a chunky design brief, if ever I've heard one. And like every good design brief, it's got a deadline. Dead being a little more literal than usual. We've got about 20 years, scientists are telling us, to make the necessary cuts in our emissions. Those 20 years are the most important because it gets harder and harder to change the system the more carbon we put into the atmosphere. And the first decade is now, and that's the most important decade. So the clock's ticking, we don't have long. This is now in very much our lifetimes, our career timelines. It's now. So what are we as designers right here in Australia right now going to do about it? So I believe our moral and ethical response to the urgent action is to accept that privileged position we've inherited and to engage in this as a design challenge. By the way, I've done something. I've just been asked to join the network. I'll just try to keep going. There we go. This is a real clock. This is the doomsday clock by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. They set this clock up in 1947 and they recently moved it to 3 minutes to midnight, which is the closest they've moved it there since the throes of the Cold War in 1984. So they use this as a kind of a alarm clock to politicians to say, yeah, we're getting close to a brink, a critical tipping point. So that might be a bit hard to see, but we need to change everything. We need to change energy, our energy systems, how we generate energy, how we grow and distribute our food. This apple has probably travelled halfway around Australia to get to me today. If you've looked at the food system, it's incredibly inefficient. It's almost like it was designed to be as inefficient as possible. Something like 20% of the food that we actually put in our, 20% of the food that we grow actually ends up in our mouth through all the inefficiencies along the way. Crazy. We've got to change how we move around the planet, around our cities, and so much more. But it's not just about carbon and carrots. It's about all of us. if this radical change is required, and really that means mobilising all of society. It's not really just about the implementation stuff. We can't get to the implementation stuff at the scale we need unless everyone is mobilised. But we live in a world and a system where 1% of the population now owns more than 50% of the bottom of that population, of the world's population. And you cannot engage enough people in this critical, urgent work if they're going to remain at the bottom. What's in it for them? And that's the problem with keeping the current capitalist system as it stands. It's actually taking wealth and and increasingly pushing it up to that 1%. So that's why Naomi's spot on when she calls out climate change as not a separate issue. She flags in her book, and there's a movie which you might like to see as well, which summarises the issues. She really says that part of the problem is we're seeing climate change as a movement, as an issue, and then there's all these other issues of equality, there's race, gender, Indigenous struggles, workers' rights. All these other issues are seen as separate, and she argues that's actually causing the problem of progress. We're not seeing climate change in the right way. She frames climate change really as just an opportunity and a deadline generator for those other issues. Because unless we make it an equitable world, we're not going to get the mass movement of people along to create the shift that needs to happen. It's that big a job. And so it comes back to us, changing ourselves, maybe not in this way. So how do we do it? As designers, in this room, right here, right now. Well, first of all, we must believe. We have to believe that another world is possible, other than the one we're born into. And we've all, you're all here, successful designers. We've all benefited from this. We have to, embrace our own. The change in ourselves and look at ourselves in the mirror and say, why am I in this position? And we also have to believe that we can do it in time. It's one thing to say we're going to achieve this radical shift. It's another thing to say, mañana, we'll get to it in 50 years, or the kind of timelines that many politicians talk about, conveniently well past their career span as politicians, certainly past the next election. Those timelines aren't useful. This is not a next generation thing. It's not our grandchildren that are dealing with this, it's us. So we need to believe we can make this change, and we need to believe we can do it in the time frame we've got. So we're going to have to draw on that renewable resource. Luckily, there's a huge amount. I can feel it in the room because you're all designers, so you're all optimists. You can't be a designer unless you're an optimist. So luckily that's a renewable resource, and there's plenty of it because we need a lot of optimism. And then we need to make others believe, and we need to give other people optimism and hope. So one of the urgent things that needs to happen, and Naomi points this out in her book, as of others, is that we need to articulate a new narrative. We need to move past the narrative that wealth will trickle down, that we're going to be happier with more stuff, that somehow if we all reach for happiness, whatever way you see it for ourselves, it's somehow going to deliver a happy society and make it just. Those methods have been, we've been told that lie for decades and decades, since World War II, the consumer capitalist argument, and it's plainly not working, and it's plainly not making people happier, and most people are missing out from that unhappiness anyway. So we need new memes, new visual and written critiques. We need to excite with possibilities, and maybe we need to scare people a little as well. It sounds like something communication designers could help with, to me. And we need to prototype new ideas, Go out in the community and co-design with others. At DE, we're very passionate and focused on the notion of co-creation rather than designing for, and I'm sure that's a concept you're all very familiar with. And after all, it's often in the doing that we design best. And these are complex issues, complex problems. You need to experiment, obviously, to find what works. The good news is that there is a massive movement of people already taking action. And I'm sure many of you in the room are already a part of this sort of progressive movement in all its wonderful shapes and sizes. These people would love, a cavalry of designers to come in and support their not-for-profits, their causes, their campaigns, create new, exciting ones as well. But just a tip of the hat to organisations like 350.org, the youth groups like AYCC, Lock the Gate in Australia, awesome community, grassroots movement really, organisation that has recently won their fight to stop fracking in our food bowl. And AGL's now pulling out of that. The many, many Indigenous groups who defeated Keystone XL in the States, if you're familiar with that massive tar sands pipe they were trying to run from Canada down through the US, and President Obama eventually refused approval. So there are millions of not-for-profits springing up all over the world, a massive green sector. There is huge movement. It's just not big enough yet. It's the start, because we're talking about societal transformational change, but it's much, much bigger than it was even 2 years ago. And so people are standing up, and often the most unlikely people are standing up, which is a really encouraging thing. And they're self-identifying as activists. I think that's really important. Like the Knitting Nannies Against Gas. And what an awesome logo. So, and often the most vocal people are the ones that have already borne the brunt of the extractive industries, which is really the hard edge of this sort of neo-colonial capitalist logic. It's go and dig things up in places that you can't see, treat the locals like shit, get out with your profits. I mean, we all know the stories. Those people have been fighting climate justice for decades. And they're increasingly getting organised, increasingly connecting with the global community. So that's really exciting, because they've got so much to teach us, because they've been doing it for so long, and they are at the pointy end. And if you're familiar with the basic science of climate, we've got to keep most of the fossil fuels that are currently on the balance sheets of the large oil and coal companies, fossil fuel companies. We've got to keep that in the ground. That has to stay there. And they've got a business plan to extract it. There is no acceptance from them that they are not able to touch the vast bulk of their reserves. They're going out and trying to find new reserves because they're confident they can, by politicians, push this process back far enough so they can get all that wealth and then switch to solar when it's going to be far too late. So history tells us when social movements gain the kind of scale that we need to tackle climate change, and I can't really emphasise the scale that we need to move to, activism becomes mainstream. And we've seen that in the history of suffragette movement. We've seen it with black rights in the States. We've seen it, workers' rights. People didn't there wasn't the fringe group doing the activism, weirdos like me. There were, everybody was going out to the protest. Everybody was doing something to participate, because it was seen as the right thing to do, as a zeitgeist of the times. And we have that zeitgeist now. And really, we all need to become activists. That's kind of my message. And embrace that word. It's not I think it's had, again, it's been probably given a certain amount of short change and been kind of sullied a little bit as a term. Maybe people aren't comfortable calling themselves activists, but we need to reclaim that. I mean, even our PM considers himself an activist. I don't know if you remember him saying that he's an activist. I'm not sure, it's kind of a bit laughable, I'm not sure it's in the same context, but at least he's legitimising the term, so I'm happy to hear him use the expression. He's right though, we need politicians to be activists, just not in the way he meant it. And I think the first thing to do as, if you wanted to pick a design challenge that's potentially, so it's hard to say what's the most urgent, but potentially the most urgent would be to get active and to redesign democracy itself, because it's very broken and it's holding back so much of what could be happening. It's corrupted by the influence of big money. I mean, America is kind of almost it is a circus. It's a, it's reality TV. Billions of dollars are going into their system, but we have very large amounts going into ours, relatively large amounts of money from corporations who then get to go to lunch and influence the decisions that are made by our politicians. That's broken. That's not democracy. How is that democracy? It's inefficient, as I'm sure you're all aware when you engage with government at any level. It's elitist. If you traced all the schools that the politicians went to, there'd be quite a large number from certain private schools in certain cities. It's monocultural as a result. It's mostly old white men with old white male thinking, no matter how eloquently it's dressed up in language and oratory. So we have, I think Australia's, the facade that it was somehow working for us, I think is really broken down. I don't know if you agree, but the leadership, theatrics of the last 5 years really perhaps show it most sort of, the curtain's been drawn back, I think. I don't know if anyone here, and please put up your hand and let's have a chat later, thinks the two-party system is working for us. Very welcome to put your hand up and discuss it, because we should discuss these issues. But, it doesn't appear to be working for anyone except a few special interest groups, shall we say. That sounds like a big, gnarly design problem to me. And it's one we've been working on a little bit at DE. So, as Finn kindly mentioned, we launched DoGooder, which is an attempt to hack open democracy, making elected representatives more accountable. It's an online platform uniquely for progressive campaigners only, and we launched it in 2010. So campaigners use it to create advocacy campaigns, raise money, engage their supporters, pressure politicians to take appropriate action. And I really just show it as an example of how us as a small agency, we've been able to create a platform to amplify our impact well beyond the service capability, capacity of DE. We've had about 1,000 campaigns run on the platform in 6 countries now: USA, Canada, UK, NZ and South Africa. And it's growing daily, and we've had major wins for progressive society in that time. So look, it's one way to address the imbalance that lobbying and campaign funding from big business have on our decision makers. And I guess just from a agency perspective, for people that are running their own show, it was designed to be self-sufficient. So we did DE design and built it, but it runs independently. NGOs pay for the service. All the profits are poured back into making it better and better. We sort of describe it as a social enterprise, really. But some of the great campaigns that are running on it are there for you. So, what else needs to be redesigned after we just solve that democracy thing? Everything's a bit broad. I mean, we all like a broad design brief, but it's probably a little broad. So how many people would sort of self-identify in the room as communication designers in all the stripes and colours in the room? As a predominant. I'm sure everyone's crossing disciplines now, so 20, 30%, okay. So look, it's the perfect skill set for the job of culture change. And look, I just threw a few things up to remind myself what to talk about. Socialism, or socialismo as it's much more sexily called in the global south, where it's not such a dirty word, needs to be rebranded. Bernie Sanders is doing a fantastic job of that right now in the States, really reclaiming this idea. I mean, the Labor Party is meant to be a socialist democratic party, yet Anthony Albanese was slurring a Greens by using the term, calling them a socialist. That's how far that system, that party's gone from their roots. Relocalisation, Bill McKibben, who's a huge hero of mine, if you know Bill's work at 350 and wrote some fantastic books on climate that have also inspired me. He talks about relocalisation not only as a kind of a mitigation response, but also as an adaptation response, because climate change is not avoidable. We're in a climate changed world today. Look at Fiji just the other day. And of course all of the storms that are happening all over the world, and droughts and fires and California, and I don't need to go on. It's too early in the morning to get depressed. But relocalisation of our food system, so we're not sending this apple around Australia. This should have been grown in Sydney, if not in Surrey Hills. Relocalisation of energy, community energy system, solar obviously, and all of the different ways we can relocalise. But relocalisation is interesting because it's not just about the systems and the technology, but it's about us as human beings returning to our local community, engaging with each other as neighbours right here, right now. That idea that we can do so much in our physically immediate location. And we're going to have to, because when the storms come through Australia, we're a while off yet because of our temperate climate, but you don't want your food coming from one central location, as it's mostly doing now. There are a couple of food distribution points in Australia's Sydney's food system, and isn't it, something like if we're basically 2 days away from starvation because we all get our food from the supermarket, and if those supply chains were cut off, what are we going to do? And if you've ever been to I always laugh, if you ever go to an event and it's, it can be as hoity-toity and whatever event you like, a workers group full of solidarity, if the food doesn't come out, an hour late, say the food doesn't come out when it's supposed to at night, notice how people start to get a bit edgy. And they start to get closer and closer to where the food source is. And almost the social contract breaks down for a couple of hour delay for food. Imagine days. It's very easy to say our social fabric is strong, we're a mateship culture. It's easy to say when you've got a full stomach. So relocalisation is an incredibly important response to resilience. So to bringing those food sources and those energy sources closer to where they're needed, both because that's a whole lot less carbon emitted to get the apple, but it also means I can get the apple should there be a massive storm that knocks all the apple trees over wherever this was grown. Less work, more play. Now, who's working over 40 hours a week at the moment? Yeah. Really? Anyone else? Almost, sometimes. A lot of us understand this, but not that many. And congratulations to all the people who are not doing that, by the way. Not as many people, I think, across society. Designers are obviously a clever bunch, but a lot of people in society are working well over what they know is healthy to stay inside this race to the bottom capitalist system. So, new memes about less work, more play. It's not a brand new meme, but it's not one that gets put onto buses and reminded. It's not shoved in people's face 1,000 times a day like having a can of Coke is. I wonder why people can recall the big brands just like that, but they might not be able to recall this kind of idea if you were to hit them in the street. Don't grow. This is a huge one. So this capitalist logic is that we've got to keep growing. The 1% need their things. They need more billions of dollars. They need that money. And the only way they can do it is if we keep growing, because there's only so much currently in our economic system. So you extract more fossil fuels, you extract more resources, we all work harder, we pay more taxes, subsidies are given to the various fossil fuel industries and others, and so wealth is generated and is extracted, and you've got to keep growing if you're going to do that. There's no way you can stop growing. Our system's built so if we stop growing, we'll go into a recession, and everyone's going to lose their job, and we're going to have big lines up. That's true. We can't just say, right, no more growth. We've got to design a change and adjust, but we've got to stop trying to grow infinitely on a finite planet. That's obvious. But it's not being acted upon by any of the people whose job it is to act upon it, i.e. politicians and wider society. The idea that less debt equals more freedom. Australia's hugely indebted personally. Anybody who has a mortgage understands that. All of a sudden, I'm one of them, all of a sudden the carefree, rebel trades in the motorbike and dons the suit to pay the mortgage, or at least takes a lot less risks because they know that this house and that debt they've got is kind of their personal store of wealth, and that's fine. However, if most of your money's going to interest, it's actually the bank that's getting most of that benefit. It's great while house prices rise, but that may not be forever, according to some experts. Anyway, point being, less debt is better for freedom. And freedom is a very powerful meme. Again, without going on, these are narratives that visual communication can help massively. The circular economy is a huge concept that's a response to this idea of growth forever. I recommend you look that one up and get involved in that. That's a relatively fresh movement that you can really participate in, because it is actually redesigning the capitalist system. And that diagram I showed you earlier is from those guys. Okay, so that's narratives and changing our mindset. It's got to happen, and it's probably the first thing that does have to happen. Then I think the other major area that I get excited about is the notion of system design. So really, it's just taking design up to a strategic level, working on big systems. Maybe it's sections, subsections of those systems, but fundamentally big systems. I've talked about redesigning democracy. For me, that's a huge one. Fix that and we can get on with other things at a far faster pace. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got that deadline, that doomsday clock is ticking, so we want speed. So let's get the politicians out the way. Well, maybe not out the way, but let's redesign their system and get some new thinking in there, some new people to join some of the people that are there now, no doubt. Essential services, government and social enterprises, not-for-profits. There's huge efficiency gains to be had. Obviously, economic models, huge. That's like rethinking capitalism, coming up with new models. Healthcare, none of this will be really new to you. Energy systems, we're doing work in some of these areas. Water systems, food systems I mentioned. Currency is a way that capitalism controls people. So again, getting involved in cryptocurrency, getting involved in designing new forms of value exchange, hugely important, and really interesting, exciting work. Waste solutions, that's where our compost revolution comes in, but yeah, there's many other aspects to that and scale. Education, that's obviously critical as we both train up people who are already active in their careers, but also people who are coming through primary, tertiary education. So that's all really big stuff and requires lots of money to do, lots of resources. Another great piece of news is that with COP21, with Paris, if you saw that, there was some very large shifts, very large pledges from the business sector, from governments. Still just pledges, not binding yet, but certainly a huge step from Copenhagen. There's money moving into the space. The divestment movement is pulling money from traditional fossil fuel investments into green investments and into these kind of projects. So in terms of just business opportunity for the sector, for designers, this is an incredible opportunity in the next 20 years to get involved in this stuff, because it's so critical that design is central to these grand projects. And I mean, I don't know, you as designers, if you watch the kind of projects that come out of government, and you can see there's been no design thinking in it. You can see that it's been engineering centric, or it's been technocratic, it's been political. Sometimes you wonder what what went into it. And you know, I get very frustrated when I know what a great design team can do in those kind of projects to facilitate the kind of thinking that can help transcend the status quo and deliver really exciting outputs. So it's so critical that we get involved in these things. So, to summarise, my ethical response to being a son of, of immigrant European parents, benefiting from my ancestors' conquest of the planet, landing here in Australia a little while ago now, was to launch DE, Digital Eskimo, as a progressive, purpose-driven agency. I did that in 2001. Just to update you, recently we joined up with Mentally Friendly, the digital product agency, with a goal of amplifying and scaling our impact to have more involvement in some of those bigger system projects. So we're working across many sectors, of the sectors I mentioned, but we've got a special focus on products and platforms for change. So if you'd like to get involved, if any of that's interesting, if you can see my email, do get in touch. We're hiring, we're growing, expanding the team, and really excited to welcome more designers to the movement to create the change we need to see in the world. So please participate. Thank you.